Good morning. It is a pleasure to join you for another Hispanic Heritage Month talk through the magic of Zoom. In the past, my colleagues and I have talked about the issues such as DACA, family separation policies, and the importance of the Latino voter. We hope that we have helped to further the discussion and provoke thought. This year's presentation is titled The Hispanic Community in COVID, Education, Jobs, Justice, and Politics. Because of the harm that the pandemic has wrought on the nation and Latinos in particular. We have all heard the heartbreaking, infuriating, and sometimes inspirational anecdotes of how the pandemic has affected families. Today, we hope to give further context to their stories. A disclaimer: before we begin, the opinions expressed on the presentation do not necessarily reflect those of San Jacinto College. So let's get started. This outline will give you a roadmap to the rest of the presentation. First, to talk about education and health, I want to introduce Dr. Alejandra Jaramillo.
Thank you. So thank you for letting me join you this year for this extremely important conversation about COVID and the Hispanic community. So I think that when it finally hit us in March, that we were in the midst of a pandemic, there was a general lack of information. I think that we were still finding out what this virus could do to people. And it wasn't until August that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention finally confirmed that COVID was disproportionately affecting minority groups. Outbreaks in workplaces, for example, disproportionately affected Hispanics. The job sectors that were overrepresented in those cases were manufacturing, wholesale trade, and construction. What's become even more clear is now is that social inequality is at the root of these trends. Hispanics are more likely to occupy the types of jobs that I just mentioned, and they are less likely to have adequate access to healthcare. Employment that falls under low wage is less likely to provide the opportunity to work from home, which became the rule right during this pandemic. And not everybody had the luxury of doing that. And that unfortunately was true of a large part of the Hispanic community. The social distancing required to curtail COVID transmission is also less likely to be enforced in certain workplaces. We saw, for example, what happened in the meat packaging plants. So it turns out that because of these social and economic inequalities, social distancing is a privilege that a lot of minorities simply do not have. Hispanics are also more likely to live in urban areas where the population density is higher, thus making this, a significant problem in the community. As you can see here on this graphic, the rate of COVID with relation to the number of cases and hospitalization in the community, in the Hispanic community, is staggeringly high. Okay, if you compare it, for example, to white Americans. Hispanics are also more likely to end up in an intensive care unit, okay, if they get COVID. So the burden, right, of this pandemic is also made more significant in the Hispanic community because of the comorbidity that exists, right? These health problems such as diabetes, cardiovascular disease. So this long-standing lack of access to healthcare is really, like I said before, at the root of the rates of COVID that we're looking at in the Hispanic community. So that's just kind of an overview. In terms of education, if we look at what the pandemic is causing education-wise, I would like to start with some of the positive trends that we were seeing in education, such as the dropout rate being significantly lower. The rate dropped, for example, from 32% in 2000. By 2014, it was only 12%. Okay, so that's a good gain made in education. That rate is still higher, however, compared to other minority groups, but significant change for the Hispanic community. In terms of college enrollment, If we look at the numbers, in 2014, that average was about 35%, and it was up from 22% in 1993. So, a steady gain as well. So we have these positive trends. However, we do still have a pre-existing achievement gap when it comes to education. So the bad news is that Hispanics still have low numbers when it comes to earning, for example, a 4-year college degree. And this pandemic is very likely to have a negative effect in the long run. And hopefully it won't undo, those positive trends that we were seeing. However, we have been seeing that Hispanic students do have more problems accessing technology. It is true that schools have provided computers and tablets. However, there are still a lot of problems with having access to Wi-Fi, for instance. So those are trends that you see. If we were to go back and have regular classroom instruction in January, 2021, Hispanic students are probably going to still be behind nearly a year in their education because of this, this interruption and all of these other factors, right, having to do with COVID. Grief counseling, if we look at colleges, whenever students do get ready to go back and be present on college campuses, Hispanic students have suffered a disproportionate, amount of grief in terms of the high death rate of COVID in the Hispanic community. So that's to be seen, right? Will students have access to the counseling services that they need? So these, I think, are a lot of the general issues that we're looking at for education. And you can see on this graphic here that the lag, right? You can see on the second part of this, or the lower part of this graphic, where it says scenario 2, that is considering if we go back to full, face-to-face classroom instruction in January of 2021. So you could see how the Hispanic community would be affected, and other minorities also.
Excellent. Anybody want to add to what Dr. Jaramillo talked about? We're seeing this very much on our campus, aren't we? Where since March, Dr. Lopez.
Yes, I think it goes back to that question of equity, especially for people of color who don't have access to healthcare within the Latino community, especially. Many are very hesitant because of the lack of healthcare to take advantage of some of these programs, especially undocumented family members. Who do they turn to as far as healthcare? I just saw this morning there was a study here in Harris County in Houston that almost 40% of children in Harris County alone do not have healthcare. So it's a wide problem, not only locally but nationwide, especially in the Latino community, as far as equity to have the access to that healthcare.
Right, and we're not suggesting that the pandemic somehow created these problems, but it certainly has exacerbated them, has made them worse, has made things even more difficult for the student who didn't have Wi-Fi before. Now they can't do their homework. Now they can't listen to regular lectures. It has exacerbated those students who did not have healthcare, especially when we talk about multi-generational households.
And some of the rates, like if you look at, white students, the rate at which they're able to log on and do, virtual classroom instruction, it's as high as 90%. And then you look at, Hispanics and other minority groups, and that number falls to about 60%. So it's a significant problem.
Professor Parent?
I just can't help but think when you look at the issue of education, how many parents are working, they don't have the flexibility to perhaps provide that oversight when it comes to online instruction, and are forced to send their sons and daughters back to school and perhaps in an unsafe environment there. And what is the long-term impact upon the state of Texas? Around half of the student population here in the state of Texas is Hispanic. and this number will increase in the next several years and decades. And Dr. Jaramillo, what you were saying, which is that their Hispanic students and students of color are nearly a year behind. This maybe will impact graduation rates, their ability to stay in school, and of course, future earnings as well. We need a well-qualified workforce in order to continue the economic progress that the state has seen over the last several decades. And this situation with COVID will have a long-lasting impact for years to come.
And we've seen the effects of natural disasters. Like this seems to be a prolonged one, right? We're in the middle of a pandemic. But if we look at the numbers for Hurricane Katrina, it caused a lot of students to drop out, students of color to drop out, and 14 to 20% of those students never went back. So those are alarming trends. We don't know just how many students are going to return, to regular classroom instruction.
One of the other things that I was frequently reminded of during this was the food insecurity problem that we have. So many students depend on their school to get at least 2 square meals a day, to get that breakfast, to get lunch. Well, we haven't had regular in-person school since March of last year. And these were many households that were already struggling to put food on the table. As Professor Parent was saying, how will this, in addition to the perhaps the 1 year loss in academic progress, affect our state in the long term? Anyone else?
Just to jump in there real quick. I was thinking, and this has happened within my own family, my granddaughter. What we sort of did with this online learning is quickly thrown these students into this area where they become independent learners. After having that assistance with teaching, et cetera, and then almost in a snap, they have to become independent learners. And we know for a fact, K through 12, it's very difficult to make those students, study independently, work independently. And that puts that extra burden on the parents to give that guidance, to which they don't have the coping skills to sort of deal with that. Especially in the Latino community, many of them, you can't turn sometimes to your parents or grandparents and say, I need help with my algebra. And they're just going to respond with, I can't help you there, right? So where do you go from there? They're sort of caught in a situation where they have to sort of depend on themselves or even other family members to assist them. And I think we're going to see more of this sort of lagging in educational outcomes because of that. So it's something that studies will be conducted, and I'm sure they're being conducted now. If anybody wants a thesis, that's a good thesis title right there to look at COVID and the learning process of the independent learners. So what are the impacts in the long run? We just don't know.
And I like the way that Dr. Jaramillo compared this to a natural disaster. Well, Hurricane Katrina came, and within a matter of months, the community was more on their feet. There was assistance coming from the federal government. And this seems to be like a slow rolling natural disaster that just doesn't go away. And it's going to take some time for us to fully, I think, appreciate just how impactful this has been. Okay, let's move on. I'm sure we'll be coming back to these topics. I found this quote in the course of my research, and this was some of the most difficult research that I've done to hear the stories of the people who we call our frontline workers or essential workers. And this is a quote that I thought captured how many of those essential workers feel. And this is from Leticia Casildo. She works for Familias Unidas en Acción, which is Families United in Action. And she said, the virus doesn't discriminate, but governments do. And much has been made about this pandemic. I mean, we've had everyone from Tom Hanks to Russell Westbrook, our favorite athletes, to the president of the United States, to neighbors, to family members get infected. This virus doesn't discriminate against socioeconomic status, race, or anything like that. And I wanted to focus, and not to necessarily adopt Ms. Casildo's thesis here, but talk a little bit about what the government has done to help people who are hurting economically from the pandemic. And the most notable example of government action was the CARES Act. And the CARES Act sought to plug the hole, let's say, or plug the hemorrhaging that was going on of savings and job losses and so forth. And it sought to address these problems in the immediate in the immediate state. For individuals, it set aside $560 billion. For big corporations, $500 billion. For small businesses, $377 billion. For state and local government, $339 billion. To plug the safety net, $26 billion. And for education, another $43.7 billion. If you recall getting a stimulus check, if you were a small business owner and you applied for PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, this was what provided those programs for you. If you were unemployed and you were receiving the $600 supplement, it was through the CARES Act. The problem, even though it did address a lot of those problems in the interim, was that the pandemic was going to be around for much longer than any of us expected. I recall our last department meeting, this is before Dr. Jaramillo joined us, where our department chair reminded us to take our computer just in case there was a disruption in operations. 7 months later, we still have not returned to work. We didn't know, even the most pessimistic of folks did not anticipate that almost 1 year later, we would still be dealing with the repercussions of this. The CARES Act was largely seen as a success in its time. Hispanic unemployment shot up, just like unemployment did across all ethnic groups. It particularly affected women, Hispanic women. These next graphs just give you a snapshot of some of the other problems that arose from the pandemic. Latino workers are heavily represented in the occupations most affected by the COVID-19 shutdowns. If you recall, and to me, like that, where were you when this happened moment was when the rodeo shut down. The Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo is one of the biggest events for economic impact in the city of Houston and for Harris County. It goes on for nearly a month. Thousands of people head over to NRG and the property and spend money and help our economy. When that shut down, it seemed like things were serious, and a larger shutdown followed after that. Well, Latino workers were the ones who were most affected by that. Latino women, and this kind of goes along with what Professor Jaramillo was talking about, when it comes to education, it's complicated by the fact that Latinx women are most likely or more likely to be single heads of households and more likely than single parents than white non-Latinx women. When it comes to employment, we have the great benefit, for those of us on this talk, have the great benefit of being able to do our work at home. And if we do get sick, to use some of our sick leave. Latinx workers, unfortunately, are less likely to have paid sick days than white workers. So when they do experience symptoms, they're less likely to be able to take time off and be compensated. I can relate to this. Back when I was in college, I had one of those jobs that you would consider essential work, where I didn't have paid sick days. And what you did back then and what so many Latino workers are doing now is you just suck it up and you just go to work anyway. Latinx workers are also less likely to be able to work from home than white workers. Again, we are very, very fortunate in our line of work to not be having to make the sacrifices that, for example, some of the public school teachers are having to make, that we're able to largely translate our work to home or replicate what we do at home. Latinx workers are less likely to be able to do that, particularly when we look at the jobs that a lot of Latinos hold. When it came to housing, that was another problem that was exacerbated, not created by the pandemic, but Latinx households are less likely to be homeowners. And over half of Latinx households are rent burdened. There simply has not been enough assistance to help those people who are, through no fault of their own, are behind in their rents. It's going to create a major housing, and we're in the process of it now, a housing crisis and a homeless problem for a lot of people who, because of evictions or other reasons, have lost their homes. We talked about the lack of health insurance. Professor Parent talked about, or was it Lopez talked about 40% of Hispanics in Harris County not having health insurance. Compared with white workers, Latinx workers are over 3 times as likely to be uninsured while employed. Throughout my research, I saw the effect that this pandemic has had on a variety of workers, but I wanted to focus my last few remarks here on essential workers. There is no universal definition of what an essential worker is, and it varies by jurisdiction. I think in Florida, they considered sports, to give you an example, essential. But generally speaking, we're talking about those workers who are in food and agriculture, emergency services, transportation, warehouse, delivery, construction, and even banking. A sizable percentage of Latinos make up the essential workforce. And I think we've all seen this just through anecdote. We've seen who it is that's repaving the roads or building the new warehouse near our homes, or who's working at the grocery store. As Professor Jaramillo talked about, the meat processing plants throughout the country. A lot of them are Latinos. But they're also less likely to have the economic and social protections that come from doing such a important job, but also such a risky job in this time. So what can be done? I refer to the Center for American Progress, which is a left-leaning think tank. And they have 7 core policy reforms that they recommend to help those people who, through government order, essentially are made to work during this pandemic. And they suggested that safety standards, that governments adopt stricter safety standards to protect those workers from airborne infectious diseases. I don't know if y'all saw some of the pictures coming from those meat processing plants where workers are elbow to elbow doing the work that they do. Well, they weren't given masks initially, and they were having to improvise. They were using just whatever they could get their hold on to try to cover their mouth, whether it be napkins, whether it be, something else. That's not enough. I think we know enough now to know what it takes to better protect these workers who have to work in these close confines. I mean, we wouldn't be sent to work and be allowed to stay there with a napkin and a rubber band covering our face. There needs to be additional compensation for the risks that they're taking. Our local HEBs, I think, for a while were offering hazard pay. And then they took it away. And then I think, last I checked, they had restored, after there was some public outcry, the restored hazard pay. This needs to be something that's across the board. We are the only developed nation that doesn't have paid family and medical leave. That needs to be something that is more prevalent to workers so that when they are sick, they don't go into work and then infect others. There needs to be access to affordable health care if they become sick. Something that we don't typically think about as an economic factor, but childcare. Quality childcare has to be available so that essential workers can go to work while many schools and centers are closed. There needs to be stronger enforcement of workplace standards. And in Texas, I know this would be a harder sell, but access to unions to help implement safety protections and compensation standards above the minimum. And again, I think a lot of us have been informed by some of the stories that we've heard, some of the really difficult working conditions in warehouses owned by some of the most profitable retailers in the world. We've heard and read the stories about people who become sick at work, have to continue going to work, and then go home and infect the rest of their family. So I think this is just my personal view on this, that we need to do more for essential workers, and we're going to make them go to work through executive orders, through policy. Then we need to treat them as essential workers and protect them a little better than we do. And that's all I have.
I just want to jump in. You mentioned when this began back in the spring, there was a run on many essential items. There was this great fear of running out of food sources, et cetera. The long lines at the grocery stores, the hours of operation that took place. And this could easily happen again. I know we look at those essential workers and take them for granted for sometimes. But I think you're exactly right. Many of those workers are the Latinos who are willing to do that type of work without the compensation or even the benefits of bringing one of those frontline workers. So some companies have responded, some have not. We want to feel safe and also have access to those essential items. So it could easily happen again here over the winter. If things get rough, we may see something again sort of develop where we don't have that access to some of these items. So what can be done? Hopefully, state, local, federal officials can, respond. But for right now, we're sort of at the status quo.
Right, and there is a glimmer of hope that the Congress and the president can agree on a new package. It's called the HEROES Act, I believe, the new proposed legislation that would give further stimulus and more help to business. And it seemed like this exacerbated problems that already were under the surface. I read so many stories about how small businesses owned by Latinos, and this was something that we were making positive progress on. There were more Hispanics who owned their own business, but how lost they were in the process of securing PPP money. Whereas we saw some of the, some companies, Shake Shack, for example, we saw, I think the Los Angeles Lakers received PPP money. Businesses that don't seem to be needing the help when you had Latino-owned businesses, because of the confusing process or lack of experience, whatever it may be, weren't able to get that help, and as a result are facing bankruptcy.
I think what we're seeing overall, that lack of organization, the lack of leading, a plan against the pandemic, is what is making all of this worse. I do want to go back to what you pointed out, Professor Amezcua, about women suffering right under this pandemic disproportionately. And I think that it goes for women overall, whether we want to admit it or not. Childcare responsibilities usually fall still on women. And it doesn't matter at this point if a woman has an established career or if she was trying to establish one. If those responsibilities fall to her, then there goes that, because there isn't an organized response. There's no, daycare or any kind of process to begin to solve any of this. Then, a lot of women are losing opportunities in the workplace, and they are being discriminated against. And it's happening because there aren't any regulations in place. So I think it goes across the board. And like you said, women who are solely responsible, for taking care of their children, I can't even imagine, what they're going through.
Yeah, the more that I immersed myself in this, the more that I thought the response was inadequate, that we almost needed a Manhattan Project type of response to this. You've seen other countries in Europe who to this day are still paying 75% of wages, 80% of wages for people to stay home, for businesses to stay closed. I think in our haste to, and there are a number of reasons, some of them are political, some of them I think are more well-meaning, but this haste to open and to kind of go back to normal life, it really made things a lot more difficult. And I think that we needed a more comprehensive package. We needed our leaders to be bolder than they typically are, because this is I hate to use the word unprecedented, but this is the worst pandemic in 100 years.
Professor Amezcua, I can't help but think that a lot of what we're discussing here with the economy in relation to COVID deals with part of, on one hand, Americans' desire to get back to work. On the other hand, their uncertainty dealing with this deadly disease, and in order to be safe, just going to work there. And that's part of now it seems to be the culture wars, wearing a mask, whether businesses should reopen. And it seems as if we do have this polarization that has led to gridlock within Washington. I think we're all hopeful that something can be achieved. What has kind of been the conservative mindset? We're looking at the Center for American Progress and their reforms. What has kind of been the conservative outlook on the best ways to approach and protect essential workers?
Well, there seems to be a consensus among helping individuals. I think that you have seen support for what's called a skinny stimulus, where families and workers would get some tax relief, if you want to call it that. There's also been I think more of a push to get establishments up and going again, and having a blanket immunity policy where you would not be able to sue or hold liable a company if you get sick in the process. But I think if I were to encapsulate it one way, I would say to just get the economy going again and let businesses figure out how to keep their clientele and their workers safe. Okay, let's go ahead and move on and talk about social justice and policies like that. I want to introduce Dr. Stephen Lopez.
All right, thank you. In the midst of all of this, we see this emergence of social protest, frustration among people of color, Latino community, as well as the African American community. The question over race, and here are some statistics here, between this divide between the people of color and white or Anglos, even between political parties, as we mentioned. Race relations, the idea of inequality in the United States really sort of blew up here with these cases involving people of color, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, police brutality, excess violence against people of color. It's nothing new. We've seen this over and over again, but it sort of was very pronounced because a lot of the frustration connected with the frustration over the pandemic and this idea of inequality. However, a lot of it seemed to be suppressed at points, and to sort of counter that, we also see people take their issues to protest in the streets. And once again, arguing about race equality. Go to the next slide. And this is quite interesting here because I found this photograph, and this took place actually in Minnesota. This was a protest movement concerning Vanessa Guillen, the young Army enlisted soldier who was murdered here over the summer. And this is a protest movement, and as you could see, it was joined by Black Lives Matter. They sort of allied themselves together and joined into the protest here And you can see both sides sort of coming together, both brown and black here, and as well as whites, their allies, sort of joining together. We've seen this take place also in some of these protest movements where both brown and white allies have sort of joined in. Initially, just very similar to what we saw during the 1960s with the countercultural anti-Vietnam War protests, sort of grew initially on college campuses, but later on joined by clergy, housewives, and just the average person joining into this movement. And this is what we're seeing, especially young people who feel a need to protest in order to get this message across that the idea of inequality in race does exist in America. Where do we go from here is the big question. Go to the next slide, Professor Mesqua. We see that these Hispanic Latinos, more likely in general U.S. population to develop COVID. Movements, protests sparked by killing of individuals, African American, George Floyd. We all saw the video of Floyd being held down by his neck and eventually die. These protests bring attention to the lack of equality in the criminal justice system, even people of color, young Latinos being subject to sexual assault, even in the military. And again, these two movements sort of coming together into a larger sort of group charging social injustice in America. What's the reaction by local, state, even federal authorities? One is to exercise our right, the right to protest, but also concerned that many of these protests have become violent, and that's a balance. Anytime you have frustration among these protesters, there will most likely sometimes see violence, and I think that's something that is the other side, or law enforcement see as protests growing out of control. You can go to the next slide. So it brings us back to equity, some of the risk factors, the conditions that impact, and we could see here some ratios comparing the Latino community against other types of individuals, other people of color, comparison to white, higher cases of COVID, hospitalization, even death, because of the pandemic and lacking access to healthcare. Next slide.
Next slide we're going to look at shows us the breakup of the population here in the U.S. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Hispanic voting trends in Texas and in the U.S. show that Hispanics are more likely to support the Democratic Party. So on average, you look at the last 5-6 presidential elections, Hispanic voters have supported the Democratic candidate for president. Here in the state of Texas, we see that that number sometimes is a little bit lower if we're talking about gubernatorial elections. So 2012 was a presidential election. You can see that 70% of Hispanic voters supported Barack Obama in his re-election campaign. In 2016, 80% of Hispanic voters supported Hillary Clinton. That being said, in 2014, we see that 55% of Hispanics supported Wendy Davis, who was the Democratic candidate for governor, and we saw that 45% of Hispanics supported candidate Greg Abbott, who of course would go on to win the election. We see that 47% of Hispanics supported the Democratic candidate for senator in 2014, and in 2018 we see that for governor, 53% of Hispanics supported Lupe Valdez, who is Hispanic, for governor. That means that you had near parity with 47%, give or take, of Hispanics supporting Greg Abbott, the incumbent, running for re-election. 64% of Hispanics supported Beto O'Rourke for senator in 2018. That means that only around 36% of Hispanics supported Ted Cruz, of course, who is Hispanic, and the incumbent, the senator, junior senator here in the state of Texas. The next slide we're going to look at is support for president among Florida likely voters in the state of Florida. We see that Trump is receiving around 46%, Biden at 48%, and other at about 6%. If we look at the next slide, we're looking at the support amongst Latino voters in the state of Florida, and actually gives a slight edge to President Trump over Joe Biden at 50 to 46% there. Should be noted, this poll was taken in the middle of September. There are other polls that show that perhaps Biden has a lead amongst Hispanic voters. It's unclear if this is an outlier or this is something that we need to really kind of pay attention to, because we know that Hispanics are more likely to support the Democratic candidate. That being said, we know that Florida has a large Cuban American population. Overall, Cuban Americans make up around 7% of the state of Florida's population, and Cuban Americans historically have been more likely to support the Republican Party because the Republican Party has been seen as tougher on communism and Fidel Castro, the late Fidel Castro, of course, the dictator who ruled Cuba for over 50 years there. So the question is Texas a battleground state here in 2020? There's a lot of evidence that suggests, in fact, it is. We'll look at some polls here looking at Texas and specifically the Latino participation. And like I mentioned earlier, around 90% of Hispanics plan on participating here in the 2020 election here in the state of Texas. Usually that number is under 40%. So that would more than double what we've seen over the last several years. In fact, in 2010, Texas had the lowest rate of participation. So regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, I think you take away from this conversation, have your voice heard, go out there and vote. And of course, November 3rd is election day. If we can take a look at the next poll, we see support for president among Texas likely voters. Well, here you can see that 48% of voters here in the state of Texas who are likely to participate plan on supporting President Trump, whereas 46% plan on supporting Joe Biden. Of course, this should jump out at a lot of people, in part because no Democrat has won Texas in her electoral college vote since 1976 with Jimmy Carter. Most of us were not of voting age, let alone perhaps even alive last time that happened. So if Biden were to win Texas and her 38 electoral college votes, it would become very difficult and cumbersome for President Trump to win re-election. Texas is the biggest prize in the country for the Republican Party there. So if we take a look at support for president amongst Texas Latino voters, we see a much different story here in Texas as opposed to what we saw in Florida. Whereas President Trump is actually, at least according to that NBC poll that was released back in September, is winning the Hispanic vote in Florida. That's not the case in Texas. We see that amongst Latino voters here in the state of Texas, 66% plan on supporting the Biden-Harris ticket, as opposed to only 25% plan on supporting the Trump-Pence ticket there. So this falls in line with what we've seen in the last several election cycles, whether it's a midterm election where you're not voting for president, but you're voting for governor, House members here in the state of Texas, governor, lieutenant governor, all these statewide executive officials. This percentage of 2/3 of the Hispanic vote, the Latino vote supporting the Democratic candidate is what we've seen in the most recent elections. If we take a look at the next slide, we see support for U.S. Senate amongst Texas Latino voters. As you can see, the Democratic candidate is receiving 47%, whereas the Republican candidate is only receiving 30%. So a pretty healthy lead, and one of the reasons why it's a very close Senate race between the Democrat and the Republican. No Democrat has won statewide political office here in Texas in the 21st century, right? So it's been over a quarter of a century the last time a Democrat won a statewide political office. It didn't happen in 2018 with Beto O'Rourke, but it could happen here in 2020. We'll have to see. If we take a look at the next slide, we see the top 5 issues that Texas Latinos want for the next president to address. And this is really telling, quite frankly, that the number one issue that Texas Latinos want the next president to address, regardless if that's President Trump being reelected or former Vice President Joe Biden being elected on November 3rd, the number one issue is responding to COVID-19. And I think a lot of us say, well, yeah, of course, where have you been for the last 8 months, right? 44% of Texas Latinos say that is their number one issue. 31% lowering the cost of healthcare. We've heard this conversation as well in terms of making healthcare more accessible, more affordable. The conversation that we had earlier, which was that so many Latino families have to make this difficult decision. Do you go back to work? Do you send your kids to school? And you know, there are no right or wrong answers there. Each family dynamic is different, quite frankly. We see that 26% of Texas Latinos say they want the next president to address improving wages and incomes. I think this deals with income inequality. Dr. Lopez talked about that, kind of leading to some of the social unrest that we've seen over the summer. And I think, quite frankly, we shouldn't be surprised. You have a once in 100-year pandemic. We've seen the economic, in terms of unemployment, reach levels that hasn't been seen since the Great Depression. It's a natural outgrowth that inevitably you would see a desire to kind of address these longstanding concerns that we've seen within the African American and Hispanic communities dealing with inequality. If there's any type of silver lining, it's this, that hopefully we're able to have this conversation, that we can listen to different perspectives there. And perhaps this is an opportunity to kind of more or less push that reset button and engage in dialogue. Texas Latinos' approval of President Trump, no big surprise that we see strongly or somewhat disapprove. 69% of Texas Latinos disapprove of President Trump, only 31% strongly or somewhat approve. And this also falls in line with Texas Latinos' views on the president and the ability to create jobs, as we'll see. So the two go hand in hand. As we see handling of the coronavirus pandemic, Texas Latinos' approval, 73% disapprove, either strongly or somewhat, of President Trump's handling of the coronavirus pandemic, whereas only 27% strongly, somewhat approve. If we look at the next slide, we see that Texas Latinos' approval of our Governor Greg Abbott here in the state of Texas, 52% somewhat or strongly disapprove, whereas 48% strongly or somewhat approve. So much more middle of the road. And there could be a variety of factors with that. In part, we've seen that perhaps some of the divisive language used by the president maybe is turning off Hispanic voters. Also, the governor, our first lady here in the state of Texas, is Hispanic, the first time that's ever happened in our state's history. So there may be some ability for Hispanics to connect with the governor and view him in a little bit more favorable light, in part because the state of Texas has also been more receptive to small businesses. And we know that so many small businesses are owned by Hispanics here in the state of Texas. If we look at the next slide, Texas Latino views on who would do a better job making healthcare more affordable, 62% said Joe Biden, 21% said Donald Trump there. So no big surprise that Hispanic voters here in the state of Texas would think that Joe Biden, on a nearly 3-to-1 ratio would believe that Joe Biden would do a better job to make healthcare more affordable. That kind of falls in line with the Democratic Party platform that we've seen. If we go to the next slide, we see Texas Latino views on who would do a better job getting the economy back up and running. 58% said Joe Biden would do a better job, as opposed to 24% said Donald Trump would be better in this regard. And it should be noted that typically in non-COVID pandemic years, this is the number one issue in which voters cast a vote. That wasn't reflected in the poll that we saw in terms of the top 5 issues that Texas Latino voters would like to see the next president address. But typically when you don't have a pandemic, the number one issue that is on most voters' minds is the state of the economy, either how you're personally doing or how the rest of the country is doing. And considering that we have unemployment at around 8%, it's no surprise that for many Texans, this is going to be on their mind when they cast a vote, the state of the economy. Of course, the perspective that the president and his allies make is that the economy was doing well before COVID. Of course, the argument that Democrats and people on the left of the political spectrum would make is that that's not currently perhaps necessarily the case, and that we've had this conversation earlier today, which is, does Congress, does the president, does some type of federal action, is it needed in this respect there? If we take a look at the next slide, we see Texas Latino views on who would do a better job addressing racial injustice and treating everyone equally. You can see that nearly 2/3 of Texas Latinos said that Joe Biden would do a better job, as opposed to 18% said Donald Trump would do better. And the president has made a concerted effort to try to reach out to people of color, African Americans, Hispanics, but is the president going to be able to do better with these groups of voters than he did in 2016? He didn't do well with either group 4 years ago, and he's lost some support, I should say, amongst white voters. So he's got to make that up. And so you've seen him work with, say, Kim Kardashian in terms of, on some level, criminal justice reform, and in hopes of maybe reaching out to African Americans and Hispanics who would maybe be more inclined to vote for a president who would be seen as addressing these longstanding issues. Also, we've seen that the president and his administration have opened up aid and assistance to Puerto Rico to try to get those Puerto Ricans who are living in the battleground state of Florida and its 29 electoral college votes to support him. We know it's all about Florida, as it has been in recent presidential election cycles, and that will be the case here in 2020 as well. If we take a look at the next slide, we see Texas Latino views on protesters who are calling for police reform. You can see that 73% strongly or somewhat support the protesters who were trying to draw attention to the death of George Floyd, who died in police custody. In the next poll, that just because 70% or upwards of Texas Latinos support the protesters who are trying to draw attention to police brutality, in this case, a situation that resulted in a death, we see that does not necessarily equal the number of Texas Latinos who believe that the police should be defunded. Now, I realize it has several different connotations, but we see that only 54% of Texas Latinos believe that we should decrease funding to police departments, whereas 46% of Texas Latinos said we should actually continue or even increase funding to police departments. So much more evenly split on what to do about funding for police departments there. And so I think the major question will be here in 2020, what is the most important pressing issue on voters' minds? And if Texas is reflective of the rest of the country, then it will be COVID-19, followed by healthcare, followed by issues such as the economy. And we'll have to see, is Texas and its nearly 40% of the population, the Hispanic population here in the state of Texas, does it come out to vote in larger numbers than what we've seen in recent presidential election cycles? If that's the case, it's very possible Texas does indeed go blue in 2020. And it's hard to even fathom that, considering the victories held by Republican candidates in recent presidential elections. So we'll just have to see.
Thank you, Professor Parent. Anyone else want to add to Professor Parent's presentation?
Just a couple of things about voter suppression here recently. The governor's decision to limit the drop-off ballot boxes, one per county, kind of affected or may affect some of those mail-in ballots. I don't know what the courts are going to do. I know there has been suits against that. Any feedback from you government guys on that sort of recent decision by the governor?
Well, because of COVID, you've seen some states expand mail-in voting to keep people from gathering in large groups and protect poll workers. Texas has a very limited mail-in or absentee voting regime. You can vote absentee if you're 65 or over, if you can prove a serious health condition, or if you're literally out of the state. I don't want to cast aspersions here, but if you want to limit the number of voters, you don't expand mail-in voting, and the state has been very effective at tamping down any attempts to do that. Most recently, here in Harris County, where everyone who's a registered voter would get an application for a mail-in vote. But another way that you perhaps, let's say, slow down voter participation is by making it as inconvenient as possible. And if you're one of those who wants to drop off your ballot at one of these drop-off locations, in Harris County, that could be a serious hassle. Harris County has upwards of 4 million residents. Harris County is larger, I think I saw this, larger than Rhode Island and about the size of Delaware. This could be a 2-hour round trip easily if you live in certain parts of Harris County and have to go drop it off. And I believe the drop-off location is where NRG Stadium is. I think that they're counting on some people saying, you know what, it's not worth it. I'm not going to go through with it. I just won't vote. I'll sit this one out. And in a close race, as Professor Parent was outlining, that could be the difference. And it could be the difference not only in the presidential race, but for anyone watching this, I really want to emphasize how important some of those down ballot races are. This is a census year. That means that we will have a better understanding of how many seats in Congress the state of Texas will have. And we've seen increases in the last 20 years. How those seats are redrawn and which constituency is represented is key. So it is important that whatever roadblocks are thrown out there, that particularly those Latinos, the 90% who have expressed a willingness to vote, go out there and vote. Anyone else?
I think that what Professor Parent was saying about the issues right there that are on the line for this election, I am very curious to see how the change that there might be, because traditionally the Hispanic population has voted according to very hot button issues such as abortion. And now that I feel that has taken a back seat to what we're seeing with the pandemic. And I just wanted to say that I'm very curious to see how this will play out with all these other pressing factors, needing to be solved by a presidential election.
Professor Parent, if I could ask you a question. Do you think that the Biden campaign is doing enough to really cultivate the Latino voter? I've seen a lot of activists, Chuck Rocha for one, who has said, Biden needs to treat this as a true battleground state. He needs to be here. He needs to have a presence here. Do you think he's doing enough, considering how close almost Senator O'Rourke, but Representative O'Rourke came to capturing a Senate seat?
I think that Texas warrants much more attention for both parties. I know that the chair of the Republican Party here in the state of Texas, Alan, I believe Alan West. Yes, he was encouraging President Trump to come to Texas, and there may be a lack of foresight by both parties after the election if it turns out the other candidate wins, in the sense that they should have paid more attention to Texas. If it turns out that President Trump wins states like Florida and Ohio and ekes out a narrow victory, and yet Texas was close, the Biden campaign may second guess their strategy or why they didn't spend more time on the ground, because Texas seems as if it's for the taking for candidate Biden. And I think that COVID has obviously changed a lot in terms of the strategy used. We do see a lot of advertisements on television, and if that's one indicator, then at least the Biden campaign understands the importance here. Same thing with the Trump administration. I think that his campaign, you see a lot of advertisements on television for him as well. And quite frankly, you usually don't see that for a Republican candidate for president. Texas is kind of taken for granted. That Biden is forcing the Trump campaign to invest in Texas shows a real weakness, quite frankly, on the president and his ability to perhaps secure the state in an easy fashion. That clearly hasn't been the case here in 2020, regardless of how the vote plays out there. Resources obviously are always very thin, so anytime you have to defend a state that usually would win shows a real liability. I can't help but think that what is the impact of Hispanic voters going out in large numbers? Obviously, that's going to benefit candidate Joe Biden. But Dr. Jaramillo talked about how that we see abortion and some of these social issues. What is the impact of, say, the vacancy now on the U.S. Supreme Court? We've heard President Trump talk about how he wants to appoint a justice, who now he has, and Amy Coney Barrett, who is obviously pro-life on the issue of abortion. And we're being very general here, but historically, many Latino voters have tended to be pro-life on this issue and tend to have a high degree of religiosity. And so it's very possible that could be a winning argument for the president and his reelection efforts here in 2020, albeit at least amongst voters in the poll here in the state of Texas, abortion was not one of the top 5 issues. But things can change. Remember, a poll is nothing more than a snapshot of people's opinion at that specific moment in time.
Right. Last year, we titled our presentation "Tidal Wave" because of the, this perceived sleeping giant that the Hispanic vote has been treated as, perhaps maybe waking up. And this might be the year. This might be the year where the tidal wave crests and we actually see major changes. I've always been struck a little bit, and it's really interesting that you mentioned how well Governor Abbott did when he ran for governor. And I agree with you that the First Lady, Cecilia Abbott, being the first Latina to be First Lady helps. But I think he was certainly more active, but I just from an observer, more sincere in his cultivating the Hispanic vote. And I think that's something that he learned from former Governor George W. Bush. And I'm struck by how many candidates kind of forget that step of actually asking people to vote for them and going to them and actually seeking that vote. I think the latest example of that, and that you showed, was an Anglo candidate who happens to be nicknamed Beto, did so much better than a Hispanic immigrant. I think in large part because he actually went out there, and that was an active part of his campaign, is getting that Latino vote, being out there for press availability and all that. Okay, well, any final closing thoughts?
Vote.
Vote. Okay. Professor Jaramillo, anything else you'd like to say to close us out?
No, I mean, I think that we talked about a lot of significant issues, and we will see how they will play out. And yes, to second Dr. Lopez's motion, yes, please vote and make your voice heard.
Professor Parent, thank you.
Let's show those pollsters that they were accurate, and let's get 90% or higher participation amongst Texas Latino voters. That would be a major development. That perhaps would be the overall theme of the 2020 election, regardless of who won, that we saw such high voter turnout. 10 years earlier, we had the lowest voter turnout. So that would go a long ways into making Texas have the highest voter turnout.
Mm-hmm.
And I want,
sorry.
And I want to concur with my colleagues and say that however you vote, for whoever you vote for, it is important that you exercise your right to vote, regardless of whether you're a fifth generation Texan or your family just arrived last year. With that, I want to thank our panelists, Dr. Stephen Lopez, Dr. Alejandra Jaramillo Fontenot, Mr. William Parent, and me, your part-time moderator, Professor Amezcua. I want to thank you all very much for watching. These are our emails if you have any follow-up questions or comments that you'd like to direct our way. Until next year, we will see you then.